Hello, Write the Docs community. I'm Marcia Reeford Johnston, technical writer at Amazon Web Services, or AWS.
And I'm Dave May. I'm a solutions architect on the AWS integration and automation team, along with Marcia.
I'm in Portland, Oregon, and Dave is in Austin, Texas, the state that he grew up in, which you might guess from his Twitter handle, HossDave00. Dave has created this Twitter account just for the occasion because I've been telling him how great you all are. So I'm counting on you to make sure he feels the love today.
And this is my first time attending Write the Docs, and I'm very excited to be here.
And I'm so glad that we're here together. My first Write the Docs was the very first Write the Docs in 2013 at Portland's Mission Theater. Some of you remember that heady weekend when tech writers, developers, support folks, all of us who share a passion for software documentation got together for the first time. It was there that I heard the terms Docs as Code and GitHub for the first time, and I had no idea what you all were talking about. I fast forward to today. This is part of our AWS team, mostly tech writers and developers. And we work together in GitHub every day, not to mention eating pizza together every chance we get. Dave's the one in the middle toasting you with his beer.
Yeah, so as Marcia said, we work closely together on projects. So rather than engineers doing the engineering work and then handing off to tech writers to do the writing work, the entire process is collaborative. Everybody operates in the same space. The way we accomplish that is with Docs as Code.
Dave and I aim for this talk to leave you with either inspiration to try Docs as Code or inspiration to keep refining the way you and your team do things, whatever that may be. Well, let's do a quick review of what we mean by Docs as Code, even though many of you already have a clear sense of it. Docs as Code means that you treat documentation the way you treat code. And that means four things, according to Anne Gentle in her book, Docs Like Code. You store doc source files in a version control system. You build the doc artifacts automatically. You ensure that a trusted set of reviewers reviews the doc. And you publish the artifacts without much human intervention. To do all this, you need a platform like GitHub. If you want to learn more about Docs as Code, visit the Docs as Code page at writethedocs.org. And while we're looking at this page, I acknowledge Eric Holscher, whose byline you see here, and who is one of the co-founders of Write the Docs, along with Eric Redmond and Troy Howard. Eric, Troy, what a contribution you three have made. We raise our glasses to you and to all who volunteer to make the Write the Docs worldwide community that it has become. So Docs, or it didn't happen. So on to our team's story. The developers on our team, like Dave, build cloud architectures, which look like this when we sketch them out in a diagram. For this talk, all you need to know is that AWS customers use these architectures to deploy software in the cloud automatically in minutes, instead of the hours that it can take to deploy the software manually. And we call this kind of architecture a quick start.
So when I help AWS partners build quick starts for their customers, that effort includes documentation, such as descriptions, deployment steps, troubleshooting steps, etc., which is where my job aligns with Marcia's.
The main thing to take away from this slide is that when Dave and I say quick start, we aren't talking about a document, which is what you might think. Quick starts are the things that we document, and the docs themselves are typically deployment guides for quick starts. So going through the evolution, we started creating docs in Microsoft Word. And 2 years ago, we moved to a Docs as Code approach. which we dubbed 2.0. And then a few months ago, we put some improvements in place, and we're calling that approach Docs 2.1. And this is all our internal lingo. So if you mention Docs 2.0 or Docs 2.1 outside of this conference to anyone outside of our team, you'll get blank stares. Let's look at the process that we started with, creating docs in Word. Most of you can relate to this basic publishing process that we used to follow. By the way, within our team, where you see developer here, we would say solutions architect or SA, as you may have seen in Dave's title. But for this talk, I'll stick with the generic terms developer or engineer. So a developer built the software, the quick start, and then created the deployment guide from a Word template. And next, the tech writer edited the doc and collaborated with the developers and other stakeholders through emails. And finally, we published a PDF. So Dave, what was your experience of this process?
It was kind of miserable. So when I
In a word?
yes,
Yeah.
so when I joined the integration and automation team, any project's engineering work and documentation work were basically siloed. So once the engineering work was completed, I would send a Word document over to the partner. The partner would fill it out and email it back to me. I would then enable change tracking, make any changes that needed to be made, and email the document over to a technical writer. The writer would then make edits, add questions and comments in the margin, and email it back to me. I'd then go back to the partner, and so it went back and forth, et cetera, et cetera. Another problem that we ran into is formatting. So the technical writer might be running Word 2016 on a Windows machine, whereas the engineer might be running Word 2013 on a Mac, and the partner might be running some weird open source Word alternative on a Linux desktop, meaning that formatting changes made by one person might not render properly when previewed by somebody else.
And for an example, one time when I was working in the doc, it came back to me with a whole chunk of text that had somehow been turned white. And it was almost invisible, and I almost didn't catch it. This is what our Word source files and our PDF output files looked like. And by the way, no disparagement on the tools themselves. Not a problem using Word and PDF. We do it all the time for lots of things. But for our particular process, this just was not ideal. So let's take a closer look at the Docs 2.0 process that we moved to 2 years ago. With Docs 2.0, a developer still built the quick start and created the doc, but now instead of Word, they used ASCII doc, which is a plain text authoring format. And then the tech writer would edit the ASCII doc files and then collaborate with stakeholders in GitHub. And finally, we used GitHub Pages to automatically publish HTML deployment guides.
Yeah, so rather than tracking changes in the margin of a Word document, which can be cumbersome, we now track all of our changes via GitHub commits, which is the same way that engineers track changes to code. We can view a snapshot from any point in the commit history and compare it to any other point in the history of the repository, and every change is linked to a particular user ID. Since quick starts are open source, this history is transparent. Anybody, even people outside of our organization, can view the complete history of documentation changes. The Docs as Code process also simplifies publication. Changes made to the underlying ASCII doc files get published to the deployment guides automatically without the need for a manual conversion by a technical writer from Word to PDF or HTML.
You'll hear that word automatic a lot in our talk. Automation is what makes Docs as Code a game changer, and frankly, what makes this whole process really fun, at least for me it is. I don't know, Dave, what would you say?
It's a blast.
It is a blast. So here's what our Docs 2.0 source files looked like. This is an ASCII doc file as it appears in Visual Studio Code, or VS Code, which is the integrated development environment, or IDE, that our developers use. And the tech writers work in VS Code now as well. We could use any text editing program, or we could edit the ASCII doc files directly in GitHub. But we find it helpful to use the same tool as the developers. Pardon my mouse there, I got a little trigger happy. You got a sneak preview. Anyhow, for me, at first, working in the text files like this, it seemed like a step back into the 80s before what you see is what you get, before WYSIWYG, when tech writers used to use tools like WordStar, putting asterisks around words to italicize them and so forth. But in fact, this is a step forward since developers live in a text-based world. They use text files to build some of the most sophisticated software around. So by switching from Word to text files, our team's tech writers have aligned with the way that our engineers work. And our content has joined the open source world.
Yeah, software developers, we've always operated in a world of format neutral text files. When developing software, there's no need to worry about formatting, so fonts, margins, etc. All that matters is the actual content of the file. Docs as code, it brings that same mentality to technical documentation. Whether collaborators are working with Windows or Mac or Linux or whatever workstation, it's irrelevant, as is the type or version of editor that they're using, be it VS Code or Notepad or just editing directly in GitHub. The underlying files used to generate the documentation are completely format neutral.
Okay, now we're ready for the big reveal. So on the right is the published deployment guide. And as I mentioned, we use GitHub Pages to publish the HTML docs to the web automatically. There's that word again. And to do this, we use a script and cascading style sheets. So no one has to manually generate or upload the final guide. It just appears in all of its formatted glory. I'll take you on a tour now through the Docs 2.0 file structure in GitHub. Each quick start has its own repository or repo, and you're looking at a quick start repo right now. For Docs 2.0, we added a folder called Docs to each quick start repository. And the Docs folder is in the main branch. In fact, both the Docs folder and the templates folder, which holds the code files, are in that branch together. And that structure made sense at the time because our docs used to pull in parameter descriptions from the code files. Unfortunately, there was a downside here. When the docs and code were in the same branch, every doc change had to go through the same automatic testing pipeline that the code changes went through. And code testing can take hours, even with automation. So if we fixed a typo, for example, it could be hours before that edit went live. The docs folder holds 13 ASCII doc files, which hold the placeholder content for our Quick Start deployment guides. And these 13 files took the place of our monolithic Word template and broke the content into separate files by topic. So this structure better supports the technical writing best practice that many of you are familiar with, known as topic-based writing. We'll just run through a summary now of the main improvements that Docs 2.0 brought our team over using Word. Dave?
Yeah, so the transition to documentation as code provided a number of benefits. So where the previous Word-based documentation process was opaque to anybody outside of email collaborators, the Docs 2.0 process incorporated the same open source nature as our code development. So now anybody can create pull requests for edits or view the edit history. GitHub tracks all of our documentation changes. Anybody can view a snapshot of the documentation from any point in the past, and anyone can see who made what changes and when. Most importantly, we eliminated the manual conversion of the Word documents to published versions. So whereas previously a minor edit required a technical writer to first manually convert the updated Word document to PDF and then manually upload the PDF or HTML file, edits were now published automatically as part of our code testing pipeline.
Automatically.
Yes.
Yeah. So now we can update docs in GitHub almost instantly, and anyone can submit changes. So if you have a GitHub account, you can create pull requests to our repositories. That is the beauty of open source content. It's also the curse of open source content, because people's pull requests are not always well written or clear or even accurate. And people don't always double check whether their edits show up correctly when they're rendered in the generated doc. So for example, early on, our team ran into a problem when a published deployment guide got updated, and no one on our team had looked closely at that update, and the result was not pretty. So if you are setting up a docs as code process, you may want to set up your repos to require TechWriter approval for quality control of your documentation edits. And now we'll run through some of the things that did not work so well with Docs 2.0. Dave, would you talk us through this summary?
Oh, yeah, sure. So for one thing, we set up Docs 2.0 so that Docs and code used the same testing pipeline, as we mentioned earlier. Developers typically create a pipeline to ensure that no breaking changes are introduced into production code. But putting documentation changes through the same code tests isn't necessary and only delays publishing. For example, a typo fix could take hours because we had to run through the entire end-to-end testing process for the quick start. Also, every quick start guide used to repeat generic content about things like AWS costs and licensing, customer responsibility, etc. This was true of our old PDFs too, by the way. This isn't unique to Docs' code. The problem this introduces is obvious. Anytime this generic content changes, the team has to manually replicate that change across the entire catalog, which is a pain. And finally, for Docs 2.0, we started with just one doc type, deployment guides that were written in AWS CloudFormation, which is the AWS Automation native format. As the team grew, we started supporting different programming languages beyond CloudFormation, and we sometimes needed migration guides or operational guides or other content in addition to just the deployment guides. As a result, each document setting file, which initially just included basic information like the author names and the publication date, etc., stretched longer and longer as we added conditional statements for all of these variations, making the process confusing for authors. So this here is a small sample that shows what I mean by conditional statements in setting files. For example, a partner building a deployment guide would have to indicate whether the product required an AWS Marketplace subscription and whether the product was written in a language other than CloudFormation and whether the product was limited to specific geographic regions, etc. Our deployment pipeline would, for instance, include information about supported geographic regions only if that particular line was present in the file.
So we realized as this list grew, it was only going to keep growing, and we clearly needed a better approach. Enter Docs 2.1. This diagram is identical to the one that you saw for Docs 2.0. So we still use the same high-level process and the same tools. And our Docs 2.1 source and output still look the same. The changes that we made had to do with things that you can't see here, such as restructuring the files in GitHub and reducing the amount of content in each deployment guide, or whatever kind of guide. So here back in GitHub, you can get a glimpse of what we changed. Our Docs 2.1 files still live in a folder called Docs, but now that folder is no longer in the main branch with the code templates. Docs now live in their own branch named Doc Edits, and Dave and the other developers gave this branch its own testing pipeline, which means that the doc updates appear instantly. And by the way, if you've heard the term CI/CD pipeline and wondered what it refers to, that was a new term to me when I joined this team. That's the kind of testing pipeline that we've been talking about. CI stands for continuous integration, and CD stands for continuous delivery or continuous deployment. Basically, a CI/CD pipeline is a way to automate parts of a development process. So to me, CI/CD means magic, which makes you a magician, Dave. Another improvement that we made with Docs 2.1 was to reduce the number of ASCII doc files from 13 to 8. And we did this in a number of ways. First, we consolidated a few of our ASCII doc files, and we also pulled out all the general information about quick starts that we used to repeat from one deployment guide to the next, as Dave was describing. And so we moved all that information into a new standalone guide that the other docs now point to. And that new guide is called the AWS General Information Guide. It looks like this. It contains 839 words that apply to every quick start that our team builds. This doc did not exist before Docs 2.1. Now the deployment guides are skinnier because they just point here.
So I mentioned earlier the problem that we had with too many conditional statements. With Docs 2.1, we've pared back to the basics. Each guide's settings file looks like what you see here on the right. The partner simply enters the product name, the product's authors, and other relevant information that's published throughout the documentation.
So for Docs 2.1, all that's left in the settings file, as you see on the right here, are basically variables. Authors define each variable here in a single source, this settings file, and then that content is populated wherever the variables appear in the doc. The old conditionals are mostly gone, and instead we've created standalone ASCII doc files for each doc type and each language. And that way our options can keep growing without increasing the burden on authors to deal with all those pieces and make sense of all those conditional things you see over here on the left side. Authors just choose the files that apply to them and ignore the rest.
So this is what our CI/CD pipeline for documentation looks like today. It's completely separate from the code testing pipeline. When you commit and then merge a documentation change in the doc edits branch of a GitHub repository, the pipeline automatically generates a formatted preview doc. Then, when you merge the approved files into the branch called gh_pages, the pipeline automatically builds the document. And if all goes smoothly, the pipeline automatically publishes the doc in GitHub Pages and makes it available to the public.
Everybody likes to see stats. And each step of the way over the last few years, our move to Docs as Code has reduced our time to publication, which was our biggest goal. You'll notice that these bars are fuzzy at the top and we have no values on the y-axis. We weren't being coy, but we can't really precisely quantify this kind of improvement since lots of variables determine how long it takes to publish a doc. None of you will be surprised to hear that. But we estimate that moving to Docs 2.0 from Word reduced the average time that it took a tech writer to publish the guide from the time the developer handed us the draft by about 25%. And then with the transition to Docs 2.1, we anticipate cutting our throughput roughly in half. So clearly this move to Docs as Code has paid off for our team. Now a few things that are coming up for us. We have some kinks to work out in Docs 2.1. For example, the permissions are not yet standardized across our repositories. So tech writers can sometimes merge our own pull requests and sometimes we can't. For another example, sometimes the docs pipeline gets stuck and we have to ask one of the CI/CD developers to troubleshoot for us. We'd like to add some automated testing and linting to our docs pipeline to catch typos and other errors. Also, we want to add version control to our boilerplate repository so that our boilerplate updates get applied retroactively to our published docs automatically back over the whole set of docs, or not applied if appropriate. No doubt we'll be adding more doc types and code variants, and we plan to explore how to best manage translations. That's a huge topic, and I haven't done a whole lot with that, so If you attend our Q&A and have questions about translation, I may not have the best answers. Dave may have a few, but that's a topic for upcoming. And eventually, we expect to arrive at perfection. La! Or maybe not. In case you'd like to check out our docs, and we hope that you will, we have 3 QR codes coming up for you. You probably know what to do with QR codes, but in case you'd appreciate the reminder, get out your smartphone, open your camera app, like you could do that right now. And then as soon as you see a big round orange code, that's the style of QR code that we chose, aim your camera at it, and you should get a prompt right away that you can click and go to the URL we're talking about. And those of you who are especially quick at this, feel free to tweet out the URLs for the benefit of others who may be following along. Okay, ready. Here we go. If you'd like to view our published deployment guides, first, go to AWS Quick Starts. This is our homepage, and I'm going to be flashing the QR code for this URL in just a moment. That's step 1. When you get there, click this checkbox to filter on AWS Quick Starts, and then pick any recent card, any of them that are toward the top. It'll by default bring up the most recent first. Click the View Guide icon at the bottom of the card. All right, here comes the code. I'll give you a moment to scan that. See how we're doing on time. We have just a few more minutes. All right. Next, I have the URLs for both of the repositories we've been talking about. We encourage you to visit our Docs as Code repos for yourself, get a more detailed understanding, clone our repos, steal our ideas, make suggestions. Here is the URL code for the Docs 2.0 repo. And next up, same for our Docs 2.1 repo. And finally, Dave and I love working with our team at AWS. If you're looking for a job as a developer or a tech writer or any number of other roles, check out amazon.jobs/AWS, and you just might find your dream team here. We would love to hear from you. Tweet us, email us. If you're attending Write the Docs right now, join us in the live Q&A session that follows the next talk.
And thank y'all so much for taking the time to view our presentation and for allowing me to participate and write the docs. It's been a great experience so far, and I look forward to participating again in the future.
And remember, doc or it didn't happen.
For Marcia and Dave, I got this question, which got a ton of thumbs up and a ton of yes, I want to know this too. It's, why did your team choose AsciiDoc over one of the Markdown languages? And I don't know if this is contentious.
Dave, I defer to you. You may have been involved in that. Yeah.
I mean, to be perfectly honest, AsciiDoctor does a great job of rendering HTML pages based on, just plain simple text files that any partner can understand or any, contributor can understand. There are Markdown tools that do the same. So it was really, 6 in one, half dozen in the other. There's no particular reason that we chose the one over the other. It's just, we decided that it worked best for our use case.
Such a simple question, or simple answer for a question.
I'm sorry, I don't have more. Like a more in-depth reason that we chose it, but no, it's.
But sometimes you have to make a decision, right?
Yeah, it was just an arbitrary decision.
Yeah, okay.
And I was not involved in those conversations, so I just jumped on once the decision was made, and I wish I had more to offer on that, but I really loved all the questions and the enthusiasm around that.
For a quick follow-up, how did you manage collaborating, if you did, with people who weren't as familiar with it? Sometimes, interactions with other tools or people who haven't used them before can be a little tricky. Was that something that you dealt with?
Yeah, so we have built Bash scripts that
Mhm.
execute an RCI pipeline that automatically build out the HTML documents. So our collaborators, our partners that we work with, our customers we work with, third parties who work with our open source stuff, they don't have to know any of that backend stuff. All they have to know is, here's a text file. It says, what's the name of the document? Who are the names of the contributors? What are the pre-deployment steps, et cetera. They just have to fill out text, and then our pipeline handles all of the workload. So it really hasn't been an issue because we've offloaded all of that away from partners and away from other contributors to our pipeline.
Wow, that's amazing. It sounds like it's really seamless.
Yes.
Yeah, continuing with the technical questions, but for Ben now, there was a really great discussion in the chat for people who are wondering just how you keep code current. I think every time you have a copy-paste situation, people's knuckles turn a little white because they're worried that if the code itself changes, how is it possible to keep the docs updated? And so maybe you could calm us down a little bit with that idea.
Sure. So I think the unit test would hopefully capture whatever that change is. So if, let's say a parameter passed to some method changes in whatever the source code is, when you upgrade a version in the code within your unit test, you would upgrade the version, and the unit test would then catch, hey, you're missing a parameter, and you know that you need to update that. And via the fact that using Bluehawk, if you are using Bluehawk, you can then just automatically regenerate those code examples to the same output files. You just rerun the CLI operation either manually or via some script or continuous integration system. It would update itself.
Oh, again, like just the fact that you can automate something and make it feel seamless, that's incredible. We had one question that was posed for Dave and Marcia, but I think we can really apply it to both scenarios. Is how are these processes received in the larger company? Some people get a little worried with change and with, they get really set into their processes. So I don't know if that's something that everybody here has, if they've encountered it before. Maybe we can start with Dave and Marcia, and then we can switch over to Ben.
Marcia, would you like me to take this one?
Well, I'll quickly say and then hand it off to you, Dave, that what convinced people was that we saved time. So really that was a no-brainer once we could prove that this process made a difference. Everybody knew the old process was painful, so people were very open to trying something new. It's partly the Amazon and AWS culture of trying new things, and partly just that we could say, hey, we've done a test, look at the difference it made. Dave?
Yeah, and so again, everything that we do is open source. This is open to the public, but that's also open, obviously, internally to other teams at AWS. So we produced a process that, like Marcia said, it saved a lot of time, saved a lot of energy, removed a lot of barriers in terms of formatting and whatnot. And so other teams have also embraced a lot of our processes. They look at what we've done, they see that it's saved time, they see that it's improved efficiency, and they're starting to adopt it.
Great. Ben, is that something that you've dealt with before?
Yeah, sure. I can talk a bit on that. So currently, us on the Realm Docs team, we are the only documentation team at MongoDB that does use Bluehawk. And we are the only one of, I believe there are 4 teams at present. And I don't have a particularly good reason for you why we are the only team that uses Bluehawk. We are the ones who made it. So that's certainly why we use it, but why they don't, I'm not exactly sure. There's certainly been a significant degree of interest from the other teams. However, none have adopted quite yet. Bluehawk is fairly new. As mentioned in the presentation, we did just come out with 1.0. That was on Friday, actually. So like 3 days ago. So while they haven't adopted it yet, perhaps that'll be changing soon.
You've been so busy. I'm just so appreciative that you also found the time to come talk with us. I'm sure same with Marcia and Dave. Kenzie actually made a really good point in the chat. It's a lot easier to fix things if they're demonstrably broken, harder to convince people to make major improvements to systems that at least appear to mostly work. Appear might be the operative word there. I think that's such a great point and something that all of you seem to have dealt with so well. And so I think a lot of us are maybe in this Q&A thinking, oh, I really want to do that too. And it's inspiring to see people who've made it happen. So I think that's really great. Ben, another question for you. When you're pulling examples from tests to docs, how do you manage user-supplied values for variables in code samples? Sorry, examples.
Sure. So there's two primary ways that we do that. One is, you could say, like a Bluehawk native way. And that is, there's actually a Bluehawk tag called replace, which basically does like a global find replace operation on the stuff within your Bluehawk snippets. So you could use that, which can be quite powerful, but it might be a little complex to implement. Or what I tend to do is, let's say the user supplied value would be like var, my value equals, let's say my API key, whatever the API key may be. I would just above the snippet define whatever the API key that I'm using within the test is in its own variable, name that variable my API key, and put that variable named my API key with the one below that's actually within the example.
Great, thanks. There's a question in the chat. Maybe this one would be good for Marcia. Is Docs code worth doing as a lone writer? And any advice for someone taking on Docs code solo?
Oh my goodness, I don't know how to answer that question well, because I haven't done it as a solo writer. There are several writers on our team, and I've been very grateful that we've been doing it together. But it certainly seems to me like it would make sense, whether you're solo or working with a team, just the efficiencies that are possible. And in a sense, Docs code enables everybody involved to put on a tech writer hat. So when Dave is working on documentation, he's essentially a tech writer. So you're not really a solo tech writer when you're working in Docs code. That's what comes to me to say. If anybody has done it as a solo tech writer, I would welcome your comments, what your experience was in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was thinking that maybe just with your experience and what you've seen and write the docs and everything that you might have a cool take on that. Thank you. Another question, did you find any resistance for writers leaving Word, then going to AsciiDoc?
Yes, I saw that question, and my answer may not have been very satisfactory in the chat because I just simply said no, but I'm not sure that that's accurate now that I think about it. I mean, even I resist in a way because Word is comfortable. It's familiar. We all know how to do it. And making the change to AsciiDoc and the whole process of working in GitHub for our docs and learning how to do PRs and giving up some control, honestly, as a tech writer, I was used to, and my team of tech writers, we were used to being basically the gatekeepers of content. Nobody could push a PDF out without us. We did it. In GitHub and in the open source world in general, there's not that same sense of ownership and being the guardians. And so you have to give up some of that. And I think there's a little bit of every tech writer that has some resistance to giving up control. Maybe it's just me, but it's been on balance really worthwhile, and we've found ways to keep control where it's really important.
Yeah, and speaking from the developer side, there was absolutely no resistance on our end. We were all so relieved to get away from Word docs with the column on the right-hand side that had all the messages and the comments and the back and forth. We were so relieved to move toward a GitHub, pull requests, commit version, which is what we're used to, in our day-to-day lives. So I saw no resistance whatsoever on the developer side. I can't speak to the tech writer side.
I was a little worried that if you kept on describing what things look like in Word, you might give some people nightmares. So that's great. Maybe we've got time for one-ish more question. We had an interesting question about timing. So how you coordinate code releases with doc releases. What if there is no code release? I'm sure timing is something that we all think about. Maybe we could go the other way and start with Ben just to see if you've got any insights there, and then we can move to Dave and Marcia.
Yeah, so at MongoDB on the Realm Docs team, we don't have like one set practice there. Probably largely informed by the fact that we're documenting, I believe it is 8 different SDKs, each of which has its own release system. On our docs team, I think we have 7 different writers. So sort of the responsibility of like one writer to keep track of a certain SDK and to be monitoring what they're doing. Maybe there's a pre-release that's published somehow, or like you can just use that code locally, or you just have to use some examples supplied by the actual feature developers. And then whenever, through your coordination, just largely in Slack, that it seems that the docs are ready to be published, we'll merge our changes and publish.
Great. Dave and Marcia, what's that look like for you?
Dave, you want to take that one first?
I apologize. I was in the chat. Would you mind repeating the question?
Yeah, just what does timing look like? So, and of course, I've scrolled away. From
I apologize. Again, I'm sorry. I was in the chat.
No, all good.
So we have moved to a procedure where we have separate GitHub branches for documentation and for code. So previously, during our initial Docs 2.0 deployment, we had everything stored at the same branch. So if there's a code update and there's also a documentation update, they could be submitted at the same time, or if there's just one or the other, they'd be submitted separately. But now we've completely separated the two. So if we have a product that needs just documentation update, right, there's a new URL for a license or whatever, we can submit that without having to worry about any code updates, without having to worry about any code testing, etc. And vice versa, if we have a code update, so we have a product that's gone from version 1.1 to 1.2 or whatever that doesn't require any documentation update, we can just submit it separately. So we've segregated code and documentation into different branches.
And the downside of that is that it takes something to be conscientious. If you do update the code in a way that has an impact or should have an impact on the instructions in the guide, you have to make a point to go over and make that update. So it is possible. There's nothing automated right now. I know this question came up earlier in the chat. That there's nothing automated that requires you to go over and update the doc when you update the code. Nobody gets tapped on the shoulder to say, hey, this is going to affect, people need to know about this in the deployment guide. So it's a little bit of a gap that requires human consciousness to go over and make that update. And it doesn't always happen, to be honest. So I don't know of a perfect way to address that.
If you did, I would hope that you would come back in the future and tell us.
If anyone out there knows, please share.
Your talks, it'll go right to the start. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I wanted to thank the 3 of you again for coming in and just sharing all of your experience and all of your knowledge. All of us were so lucky to be here and to hear both your talks and your questions, as well as your answers to all of our questions. Thank you to everybody who submitted questions. I apologize we couldn't get to all of them. We're going to take a little break. The next talk starts at 11:10 Pacific on the main stage. Just a reminder that Unconference is going strong. You can go into the Sessions tab and check them out. Also, if you want to submit a 5-minute lightning talk proposal, you've got until 11:45 Pacific. So good luck. And thank you again to the 3 of you. This was so fun, and I hope we get to see you in the chat for other talks.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.